I like to read. I can read. Join me, won't you, as we travel into the world of Zenith by S.L. Scheinbaum, a guy I met in Barnes & Noble who was painting in there, and he gave me his book. And I thought it'd be fun to read a book out loud on the YouTube live, because I want to get better at reading. I want to read a book a day for the rest of my life, and the only way I'll do that is if people are watching me. Otherwise, what's the point? So, this book is called Zenith. Let's dive in, shall we? This is the first chapter. It's lightning bolt chapter. Headings: The Man with the Gray Flannel Dashiki. A quest is a search for the sacred, be it a sacred object or a sacred state of mind. Some quests are designed to separate the sacred from the sanctimonious. Seekers pursue some with an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. Pilgrims, driven by a cleverly sublimated lust, I don't know what that word means. For years, Michael had been studying within the stone walls and cloistered confines of great American universities. He was preoccupied at the end of the 20th century with questions that had been asked and remained unanswered for thousands of years. These scholarly efforts had eventually coalesced in the attempt to understand the single element of mind: memory, its limitations and limitlessness. Was this metaphysical object the subject of the fledgling Swami's quest? The mysteries of memory and intuition deepen when the consciousness of past events is illuminated by emotion. Reading's hard. Recollected in tranquility, emotion alters the shape and density of time. To some, time is a thread unwinding on a giant spindle. It winds backwards into the past, into the mist of legends and history, into prehistory and the magnificent creatures of the Jurassic past. Mystics perceive a wheel of eternal return on which we will perpetually relive both past and future, repeating endlessly each moment unto the last syllable of recorded time. Michael's life was the attempt to remember his connection with the infinite, to experience perpetual deja vu. He also remembered that he had a girlfriend in Ann Arbor, Michigan. She was staying at a bizarre student commune from which emanated the teasing letters that arrived at unexpected moments at his abode in Atlanta. Her pale pink nipples, golden hair, and angelic face had assumed an almost transcendental aspect in the glow of memory. He had last glimpsed her in the marbled halls of the University of Michigan 18 months earlier. He had recently been feeling the need to complete a few more hours on his perpetually unfinished graduate degree in metaphysics. With synchronicity attributed to the intervention of an unseen cosmic hand, the enticing mantra-like sound of a single phrase, road trip, road trip, road trip, had also begun to echo in his thoughts, so throwing all of caution to the mild and flower-scented winds that circulated through Atlanta, he decided to go north. In the year and a half he had been in the South, Michael had renewed an acquaintance with Patricia Krasner, a 30-something biological scientist. She was divorced, and for the medical student she married when they were undergraduates at Tulane and Sophie Newcomb, respectively. There was something smudgy about Patricia, a dark dirtiness that matched her undoubted intellect. Her disheveled appearance and combination of aggressiveness and spiciness in her personality kept getting her into trouble. Some people accused her of being a witch. Others, with more mundane imaginations, accused her of seducing their boyfriends' sons, etc. Michael wasn't sure if any of this was true, but there was no doubt that she had seduced him. Despite her 19th nervous breakdown, she had applied and been accepted to the Graduate School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University. She was determined to leave Atlanta and its gossip, even if on a suicide mission. So she hitched a ride with Michael as far as Baltimore. Traveling north on I-85, Patricia spent much of her time looking into the rearview mirror while putting on sunscreen and primping distractedly. Even so, she looked like the survivor of a tropical storm. After driving most of the day, they pulled off of I-85 a few hours after dark, checking into a small and reasonably tawdry North Carolina motel. Michael had prepared for a long and arduous road odyssey by making a number of talismanic acquisitions. He bought a pair of black leather driving gloves from a Goodwill store, clipped a photo of German tank commander Erwin Rommel onto the sunscreen inside his car, and watched The Road Warrior twice on his DVD player. Now, at the motel, he slowly stripped off his driving gloves with exaggerated machismo, trying to get a laugh out of Patricia. He walked over to her and unbuttoned her shirt to the waist, kissing her braless breast as they became exposed. Before proceeding any further, they went over to the bathroom to shower off the road grime, residue of the Georgia red clay and Carolina dust. When he emerged, he found Patricia engrossed in an episode of The Twilight Zone. He slid under the covers as Rod Sterling completed the introduction. As the program started, a sad old woman dressed in black was seen walking alone through a desolate forest. A young girl in white walked toward her. When she saw this newcomer, the old woman shrieked, horrified, and ran away. The camera followed the young woman home. When she entered she found two survivors in a violent quarrel. Commercial break. Patricia and Michael kissed and fondled for the length of time required to sell Bufferin, Buicks, and Vagisil to millions of Americans. When the program resumed, Patricia insisted on the return of their attention to the screen. The young girl made her choice, marrying one of the contending suitors. He turned out to be an abusive drunk, made of rotten mess of things, and finally left his wife alone. This young girl in white, now an unhappy old woman dressed in black, went out for a lonely walk in a desolate wood. In the course of it, she was a young girl, clothed in white, walking in the opposite direction. She realized that she was having a form of deja vu, and that the young girl was herself at an earlier age. She realized in a flash of desolation that her fate was sealed, and that the grim sequence of events would be repeated endlessly. She shrieked and ran away. Michael was just slightly stunned to realize the program was about deja vu. Memory time and deja vu. At times, he thought about them in academic and philosophical, sophisticated terms. At other times, in pop culture or more common terms. But one way or another, he was usually thinking about them. Now, when for a moment he was not thinking about them, they had come unbidden, as deja vu often does, onto the screen and the scene. Rod Sterling, Urbane, creator of The Twilight Zone, was under the influence of LSD, it is said, when he conceived his famous series. It was at that time a student at Antioch, bastion of great thought and unfocused intellect. Maybe some fragment of his dreaming mind planned this sort of coincidental synchronicity. When the TV finally turned off, our little travelers were turned off too. Nothing transpired in the night to disturb the all-powerful dark eye, which they had been watching and which now watched them. On the road the next morning, a young man's fancy turned to Zen. All good pseudo-intellects know that Zen is defined as the indefinable. It is everything in that its goal is the void, a conceptual emptiness that presents the mental space that allows creations to become manifest. It is nothing that it looks past, or form of multiform illusions, citing the void from which illusions emanates into which they return. Zen attempts to reach a place in the mind that is colorless, odorless, and painless. A Zen master can produce a symbol of this picture state by an arrangement of flowers so balanced and harmonious that they seem to have always existed, or by drawing and shooting a bow with impeccable motion, or by a tennis stroke. The word Zen comes from Shan, the Chinese word for meditation. In Japan, Zen practices were used to inculcate focus and spontaneity to the Bushido, or warrior class. It was easy for Michael to meditate during the remainder of the ride to Baltimore because the alternatives were singularly unappealing. Patricia had developed a case of galloping hypertension at the Maryland border. Her nerves twitched every time her mind, wandering and unfocused at the best of times, approached the next step in her plan. She was exhibiting some form of pre-yuppie syndrome. The symptoms seemed to include deep, intense horror at any word or deed not in strict conformity with what he supposed was the young urban professional code of conduct. Variations from this inscrutable standard resulted in furious attacks. When Michael committed the variations of tearful self-abuse when she did, the stress caused by attempting to enforce this meaningless and quite possible non-existent code left her talking with endless expressiveness about vague hopes and nebulous fears for the future. This was making the driver almost equally edgy, so he retreated into a meditative state. focusing on the right edge of the lane as he drove and gradually sunk into an alpha state. He assumed, perhaps too casually, that the instinct for self-preservation would rouse him in case of an emergency. They finally got to Baltimore and consulted the university housing services. They found living quarters for Patricia in the home of a young woman lawyer, a place where Patricia could fall apart at leisure in a refined and comfortable manner. After a very short stay, Michael headed for Ann Arbor. It's Chapter 1. Chapter 2 is titled Mad Max. We'll read this real quick. When he arrived in Ann Arbor, he had to find Ellen's exact whereabouts. She had recently moved into a kind of radical socialist environmentalist boarding house. It was a converted fraternity house containing an assortment of eccentric people. There was an enthusiastic young communist who had wire-rimmed glasses, a tie-dyed T-shirt, a long ponytail, and a huge poster of Karl Marx's face on his door. From behind his door, a communist radio affiliate blared rhetoric at impossibly high decibels 24 hours a day. There were new wave and punk stylists with orange and purple hair. They had uniforms of torn leather enhanced by grotesque metal artifacts. Then there was Fritz, a fugitive of a Hermann Hesse novel, an overly sensitive student intellectual of German ancestry like the tough kid from the Bronx in a World War II movie. Fritz was an inevitable part of this philosophical movie. He was obsessed with resolving the dichotomies of life, naturally gravitating toward the precision and order of the hard sciences. He was seduced from them by glimpses of even evanescent spiritual beauty of poetry. He was German romanticism in the flesh. Just when Michael thought he could store it safely away his old Steppenwolf albums, immediately upon meeting Fritz and Michael started to discuss everything. The notion that personal identity is socially and commercially constructed by subliminal means, that truth is a socially constructed, historically bound entity, that personality represents merely a coalescence at any given point of the ego's journey to an indefinitely distant place, nebulous and ultimate. Soon Fritz was waving his hands in the air, describing circles and ellipses, tracing the graceful orientation, motions, graphics, symbols of spiritual progress. The origin of the circle represents Western philosophy, said Fritz, with regard to its individual ego. The endpoint of Mayhem Buddhism is it conceptualizes the universe. Fritz was soon shaking hands with himself and uttering, the snake swallows his tail, in a callow but happy voice. Earlier this evening, he went on with self-conscious aplomb, his spectacles reflecting light, his plump body, clothed in an expensive white shirt and tan slacks, relaxed on the couch. I was reflecting on some recent past events. I'd given up computer science. It just wasn't meaningful enough to be my life's work. I happened to glance out my window, and into a window across the courtyard. A hand emerged from the window. It was holding something. Then it started to unravel page after page of computer printout paper, an immensely long roll trailing to the ground. It seemed an apt symbol of consciousness, which was unraveling and would be discarded. So many pages of my former existence as a computron. The conversation went on in this way with short breaks for several days. Ellen finally intervened, dragging Michael to the arboretum, where the student frolicked, to talk, drink ice-cold peppermint schnapps, and smoke galoshes, thick, filterless French cigarettes. Ellen was from Royal Oak, a suburb of Detroit. Detroit was famous for automobiles, murder, and being a rough place to live. Royal Oak, on the other hand, was only amazingly vapid, like a boring dream, an endless strip mall of corporate logo stores and bars. This gave Ellen a thick surface from film of boredom, which hid her bright inner spark of joy like smoke choking a flower. When she complained once too often about how boring it was to be from Royal Oak, Michael assumed the role of druid priest and cursed her with magical words. Bethuldu! He raised a hand heavenward, looked at her solemnly, and intoned in his deepest voice. He was a natural tenor. Bethuldu, Bethuldu, Ellen Lindquist, Bethuldu. Their laughter resounded in the trees of the arboretum. She was trying to choose between a sensible career as a journalist or a teacher or something more appealing like a theater or poetry. Come embrace me, she had written. in forests lit with heaven's light, or when the clouds have hidden heaven's eyes, let your eyes be sun, torn in return between the usual polarities, freedom and conformity, joy and gloom. Ellen failed to go in any definite direction. Usually she felt guilty about that. When she didn't, she felt guilty about not feeling guilty. A few days after Michael and Ellen had settled into the tiny cubicle of a room that was their radical love nest, a space large enough to recline in side by side if they didn't breathe too deeply, Ellen had a curious dream. And we'll stop there at the dream part. Again, this is called The Zenist. I'm going to keep reading. But for now, bye-bye.